In this video, I'm going to show you how to create the domain model or the database for Hannah's Cake Shop. So before we start to build our database, let's go look at the types of data that Hannah is looking at capturing for the Hannah Cake Shop app. I'm going to come back to our wireframes, and I'll expand these out, or I'll make these a little bit bigger. And we can see for customers, she would like to capture the first name, the last name, phone, email, address, and birth date. And for the products, the product name, the product price, the cake flavor, and the icing. So we're going to go into Mendix, and we're going to create a database to capture or to store these types of data. We're going to create two entities, one entity for customer, and we'll add these attributes to that entity. And then we're going to create a second entity for products, and we'll add these attributes to that entity. So let's go ahead and get that done now. So I've turned off my video so the video doesn't get in the way. And if you haven't already, log into your Mendix account and go to your app, double click to open it, and then edit in Studio Pro. Click the button over on the right-hand side, edit in Studio Pro to start editing your app. And go ahead and use the defaults. Okay, so as we indicated in the setup, we're going to do most of our work in this My First module. And in this video, we're building the database. In Mendix, it's called the domain model. So go ahead and double click on domain model to open up that tool. And we can see this is our work area. This is where we're going to create our database. Now, the way that Mendix approaches this in its low-code approach is you basically create like an ERD, an entity relationship diagram here, and then Mendix will build the underlying database. Make sure that toolbox up here is selected, and then you're going to click on entity, and you're just going to drag it out here. And that'll add your first entity. And the first entity that we're going to create is for customer. So double click on the entity itself, and its properties then come up. And the name of our entity is going to be customer. Now, as a standard, I like to have my entity names all in caps. And it's good practice to use a singular version of your noun, not plural. So we'll call it customer. We'll use the defaults for the generalization, image, and persistable. And then down here, about in the middle, you can see that we have some tabs for adding attributes, adding associations, validation rules, etc. So we're going to start with the attributes. And as a quick review, we said for customer, we're going to add first name, last name, phone, email, address, and birth date. So down here under the attribute tab, click new, and we're going to say first name. Now, as a standard, I like to use what's called camel case when naming my attributes, which is basically capitalizing the first letter of each word and then squishing all your words together if you have multiple words so that there aren't any spaces. First name. You can add documentation here. First name's pretty explanatory, so I'm not going to worry about that for now. The next thing that you need to select is the type of data this is. And if we look here, we can see there's many different types of data that you might have out in your database. String is the most generic type. You can put inside of a string data element any alphanumeric character, numbers, symbols, letters, numbers, etc. You can limit the length if you want. 200 is pretty big for the first name, but I'm just going to go ahead and accept all of the defaults here and say OK. And then we want to add the last name. So click New, Last Name, String again, and I'm going to accept the rest of the defaults. We'll do email, string, accept the rest of the defaults. We'll do phone next. I'm going to let my phone number be string. I could call it integer, but I actually want to have it I'm going to store it in a formatted way in my database with the parentheses and the dashes and whatnot. And if I use the data type integer, it wouldn't let me put that formatting in. So I'm going to call my phone number. I'm going to use string for my phone number. We had also address, new. Now, typically in a design, you might have separate attributes for like address line 1, address line 2, your city, your state, your zip might all be their own attributes. But for simplicity, I'm just going to jam them all into this one address attribute for our purposes. And the last thing that we're going to add is birth date. And now on this type, we're going to use not string. We're going to actually use the data type of date and time. And the reason for this is because with Mendix and its low code, if I designate this as a date, Mendix will go ahead and build in edits so that a valid date is always entered. And it'll also give me a date picker at the end of my input field. I'll show it to you when we create our pages. But you'll want to make sure that birth date is set up as date and time. And the rest of the defaults are okay. Now, if you got a little bit ahead of me and you added birth date as a string, it's okay. Go ahead and select it, choose edit, and you can then change it to date and time. And once you've added all of your attributes, you can say okay. And you can see there's customer and there's our attributes out there. And again, if you made a mistake with anything, you can go ahead and just double click your entity and you can edit anything. You can edit as need be. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create the entity for product. So take our entity, drag it out, double click on it. We're going to call it product, all capital, single, not plural. And then we're going to add our attributes. And as a quick review for our attributes, let's go look at our wireframes. And we can see here we're going to have product name, product price, cake flavor, and the icing. Now, sometimes it's helpful to go ahead and get a feel for the type of data that's going to be used. So let's go look at a list of Hannah's products. If you scroll to the bottom of this, we can see that we have the product name, we have the price, the flavor, and the icing. I'm noticing that price, she does have some decimals out here. When you go ahead and before you turn in your sprint, you'll want to make sure that you add all of these products out to your system. I'll show you how. But for now, we're just going to create the database to capture this information. So first attribute is the product name. I'm just going to call it name. I could say down here, the name of the product if I wanted. A string is fine, and the rest of the defaults are fine. Next, we're going to add price, new, price. And you'll see for the data type, Mendix is pretty smart. It used little AI. Mendix noticed the name of my attribute was price, and it guessed that my data type was going to be decimal. And that's correct. We do want to use a decimal data type. Decimal will allow for only numeric values, but it'll also allow for a decimal instead of just integer. So we say, okay. The next thing that we're going to add is cake flavor. And again, I'm using my camel case to name my attribute, cake flavor. And now if we have a look at our data out there, we can see that Hannah's cake flavors are limited to vanilla, chocolate, and yellow cake. So you're going to set up this data element to be a special something called an enumeration in order to handle our cake flavors. Let me show you how to create that. So in our data type, we're going to use enumeration. And enumeration is going to be a little object out in our system that stores the valid values for our cake flavor. Now, we don't have that enumeration object created yet, so I'm going to just say new when it says to select enumeration because I don't have one. We'll say new, and it's going to store my cake flavors. And I'm just going to call it cake flavor. And we'll say, okay. And for my documentation, I'm just going to say a list of valid cake flavors. And then we have to define what those values are. So we're going to say here, new, and we have chocolate. Click new, we have vanilla. And new, we have yellow cake mix. Okay, so now I've set up the valid values for my enumeration. We'll say, okay. And you can see now I'm back to my window where I'm adding the attribute. And you can see the data type is enumeration. You can see that the data type is enumeration. The name or the object where my enumeration is stored is called my first module cake flavor. And then we can actually see the values here. And we'll say, okay. Now, again, if you got ahead and you just set up cake flavor to be a string, you can go ahead and double click on it, edit it, and change it to enumeration. The next attribute that we're going to add is for icing. So we're going to say new. We're going to say icing. And again, when we look at our data, we can see that there's a limited choice to the types of icing. And one thing that enumeration will provide is a drop-down ability for the valid values. Then Hannah doesn't have to be typing in any of these actual code values. You don't have to worry about spelling licorice right, etc., etc. So let's go set up an enumeration for icing. So our data type for icing is going to be enumeration. I don't have one set up already for those values. So I'm going to say new. And we're going to call it icing. And we'll say okay. And we'll click new. And we had pink. We had licorice. We had white. We had chocolate. And we had orange. Okay. And again, we can see there's our enumeration values. It all looks good. And so we have our 4 attributes in defined for our product entity. And we can say, okay. Now that we've done a little bit of work here, we want to make sure that we save our work. So come up to File and Save All. Okay, so in this video, we went ahead and we looked at how to create a domain model, which Mendix will then convert into our database. We learned about different data types. String is very generic. It will pretty much hold any type of character. Dates are helpful. If you have a date, you want to define it as a date type. Mendix will then provide some editing and a date picker at the end. And we also used a decimal as well as enumeration. If you didn't already, make sure that you save what you've done so far, and then you can move on to the next video.